Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts on The Pale King by David Foster Wallace, and I'll open by saying I was legitimately shocked at how much I enjoyed this book, how much I appreciated the themes that Wallace was exploring, where he wanted to go in these pages, the ideas, the people that he populated this book with, I thought were fantastic. Now, it is an unfinished novel. This is about 450 pages. It was nowhere close to being finished. There's another maybe 20 pages that flesh out some details, draw some connections that would have emerged had more of the book been written or polished in such a way that it flowed together in a coherent narrative. But what this book contains is really profound. Wallace digs at one of the critical themes of being a person in the 20th century, particularly a person who is literate and can examine the news and make, inferences. And that is, what does it mean to be a part of a society, to contribute to a society, and to systems that are systematically dehumanizing, that crush people, that do not value the voice, the unique individual person at the heart of any individual, but rather sees people as commodities, as objects from which dollars and cents can be squeezed and then discarded. And that's something that is becoming more and more relevant and resonating at a deeper level as this century progresses. But it's something that Wallace was deeply interested in, and I think was, in a sense, very broken by. It was something that he dug at in his final nonfiction, whether it was essays or a commencement speech. It's something that he's obsessing over for pages in this book in different ways. He comes at it from different perspectives, but what does it mean to be bored? How can one be an individual and be a proud individual, a person who is rationalizing our existence, our lives, while knowing that this is the world we inhabit and this is what is happening around us and to our loved ones? And is there any lever we can pull that changes that? And that's something he doesn't entirely answer, but it's something he's grappling with throughout these pages. And so on a different level, I'm so glad I read this when I'm in my 30s now, rather than when this first came out when I was in my 20s. That there's so much in here that this is for an adult reader. It's for a reader who has had a job, who has experienced disappointment, who has experienced elation, but has also experienced disappointment and wonders, where do I go from here? What's next? How does the second half of this game go? Because I'm stuck playing it. And so there's a part where Wallace really just lays this out. He has characters lay it out, but he lays it out as well. And this is about 400 pages into the book. And he writes, I learned that the world of men as it exists today is a bureaucracy. This is an obvious truth, of course, though it is also one the ignorance of which causes great suffering. But moreover, I discovered in the only way that a man ever really learns anything important, the real skill that is required to succeed in a bureaucracy. I mean really succeed, do good, make a difference, serve. I discovered the key. The key is not efficiency or probity or insight or wisdom. It is not political cunning, interpersonal skills, raw IQ, loyalty, vision, or any of the qualities that the bureaucratic world calls virtues and tests for. The key is a certain capacity that underlies all these qualities, rather the way that an ability to breathe and pump blood underlies all thought and action. The underlying bureaucratic key is the ability to deal with boredom, to function effectively in an environment that precludes everything vital and human, to breathe, so to speak, without air. The key is the ability, whether innate or conditioned, to find the other side of the rote, the picayune, the meaningless, the repetitive, the pointlessly complex, to be, in a word, unboreable. I met in the years 1984 and 85 two such men. It is the key to modern life. If you are immune to boredom, there is literally nothing you cannot accomplish. And that is horrifyingly true. We have found people who grapple with boredom by using shorter and shorter bursts of amusement or entertainment or distraction. I remember 20-ish years ago reading an editorial in a physical newspaper while I was eating cereal for breakfast in high school that referred to this world that was emerging on the internet as not the age of information, but the age of interruption. And this was before so many social media apps. Facebook was out at that point, but it had maybe just arrived, and the idea of constant interruptions all the time was something that was not the same. Text messaging was not super prevalent at this point, but that idea of interruption is one way to deal with boredom. And what Wallace is getting at in The Pale King is there some other way to deal with boredom? And we see, he reveals individuals who have different ways that they try to do this. And we see some really interesting personalities emerge across these pages, even though we don't have this full novel. We don't have full arcs, the way that he was able to create in The Broom of the System or in Infinite Jest, or even some of his stories. But what the details that do emerge of these individuals really does get at this idea of people trying to share their voice and find their voice, and want to speak a little more loudly in whatever corner of the world or the office they inhabit. And so I really love this. I thought it was humane. I thought it was a book that was far more interested in people and human beings than characters. Now, there are some sophomoric David Foster Wallace jokes in there. The most common one, frequent one, is a character who's never really introduced, but who's a supervisor, a boss at this IRS office, regional office, whose name is Merrill Laurel. And there's a joke about Merrill Lynch in there, the financial company. But the Merrill Laurel, it gives that alliterative flow, that rhyming flow that Wallace loves to play with. But honestly, this is a book that is far more interested in what does it mean to be an adult who is working our way through a day that does not provide us with everything we hoped it would, but finding our happiness each day and finding our happiness each month, each year, as we share this world together. It's far more concerned with that than the sophomoric, like, did everybody just hear the joke that I made? Wallace that was in The Broom of the System or even in Infinite Jest. And so I would encourage folks to read this. Again, if you are, if you're at a place where I think this is an adult book, in the sense that I think Wallace is very much writing this as an adult who has experienced real disappointment, whether it's personal or professional or financial, whatever it is, who is someone who's experienced disappointment. And some of us sadly experience that as children, due to circumstances that have nothing to do with us, and sometimes nothing to do with our parents. Some of us have experienced that disappointment, but for many readers, waiting to read this book until one has had taken some lumps from life is probably going to make it a more rewarding reading experience. So I do want to get into it now, but I did just want to share that as this opening. So the book is set at a regional tax examining office. So it's the most mundane, miserable bureaucracy imaginable. It's in 1984, 1985. There are some postmodern metafictional techniques in here. There are some passages that are incredibly like David Foster Wallace. They're polished. They have the run-on lists of, coherent excess and hysterical realism. But there are also passages that are just a section of dialogue between two characters that illuminates one of these themes, or that illuminates something about one of the personages, the characters that we're going to spend more time with later. The book is not divided into chapters, but rather sections. So it has this sort of circle with the S curving through it because it's the tax code. There's even a joke about the facade of the building is written has the tax code written on it. And then of course the tax code was updated months later. And so now the building's off slightly. And there's all sorts of environmental jokes within the setting, these ironies about just how ridiculous we set things up within offices or cities, that or the protocols we have to go through for someone to check in for their first day at a job. So there's all sorts of that. But there are also a couple of really long sections or chapters that are almost, I think one has been published as a novella. There's a second one that probably could be, that give these long, in-depth 80 to 100 page sections that really focus in on one or two characters and what they're grappling with in life. And I loved those. The other part that's in here is a continuing narrative of one character, and we see just the horrors of her childhood, and the actual violence, this abuse she's dealing with, the danger she was in as a child. Those passages really recall Denis Johnson, who I know Wallace was explicitly a fan of. He like cited Angels as one of his favorite books. There are definitely passages where Wallace is like trying to write in his vein with the standing on the shoulders of Denis Johnson, or of perhaps early Cormac McCarthy, pre-Western Cormac McCarthy, so like Suttree, maybe Child of God, Outer Dark, in a sense. So that's sort of what's going on. But I did want to share some more passages, some more pages. He opens with this flight into land, showing up in this rural section of the Midwest where there is this, it's this idea, there's this corporate office in a Midwestern town, and all around the town are all of these these fields and the different flowers that grow there by the side of the road, and all of the nature that's there. And then suddenly it's like, what does it mean to be in this town? And then within that is less natural, and then into an office that's even less natural than that. And ultimately, like sitting in these cubicles and in these long rows with other people, like what does that mean to have moved farther and farther out of nature and into the constructed world? So that's how he opens. But then from there, we just really embraces ideas around whimsy, but also modernism. So one passage, let's see. One section is all about a series of videotapes about what does it mean, like, why are you here? What is going on? 3 or 4 years ago, the new president, the current one, got elected into office on the promise of a big defense spending and a massive tax cut. This is known. The idea was that the tax cut would stimulate economic growth. I'm not certain how this was supposed to work. A lot of the upper policy ideas didn't reach us directly. They just trickled down to us through administrative changes in the service. The way you know the sun's moved, because now the shadows in your room are different. You know what I'm saying. And then there's a question and an answer, kind of like in Brief Interviews with Hideous Men, where there were sections where there were questions. We don't know the question, we just see the answers. That's happening here. I'm single, and single men are the ones in the service that get reposted the most. Any repost is a hassle for personnel. Reposting a family is worse. Plus, you have to offer incentives for people with families to move. It's a treasury regulation. If you're single, though, you stop even unpacking. It's hard to meet women in the service. It's not the most popular. There's a joke. Can I tell it? You meet a woman you like at like a party. She goes, "What do you do?" You go, "I'm in finance." She goes, "What kind?" You go, "Sort of a type of accounting. It's a long story." She goes, "Oh, who for?" You go, "The government." She goes, "City? State?" You go, "Federal." She goes, "Oh, what branch?" You go, "U.S. Treasury." On it goes, narrowing down. At some point, she figures it out, what you're dancing around. And she's gone. And then the very next entry goes, "Sugar in a cake has several different functions. One, for instance, is to absorb moisture from the butter, or perhaps shortening, and release it slowly over time, keeping the cake moist. Using less sugar than the recipe calls for produces what's known as a dry cake." Don't do that. But as this is pushing forward, one of these people lays out an idea that Wallace plays with later on. He goes, "I had an idea, and I'd try and write a play, and I've been to plays, but this is to give you an idea. The idea is that a wiggler or road examiner is sitting poring over 1040s and attachments and cross-filed W-2s and 1099s and like that. The setting is very bare and minimalistic. There's nothing to look at except this wiggler who doesn't move except for every so often turning a page or making a note on his pad. It's not a tinkle. It's just a regular desk. So you can see him. But that's it. At first there was a clock behind him, but I cut the clock. He sits there longer and longer until the audience gets more and more bored and restless. And finally they start leaving. First just a few, and then the whole audience, whispering to each other how boring and terrible the play is. Then once the audience have all left, the real action of the play can start. This was the idea. I told my stepmom all about it. It was going to be a realistic play. Except I could never decide on the action, if there was any, if it's a realistic play. That's what I tell them. It's the only way to explain it. And there's a lot going on there where Wallace is making a joke about the fact that our entertainments rarely show people doing what they spend most of their time doing. We even TikToks that I don't have TikTok, but some things will pop up where people will send me things that show like, POV teaching freshmen or POV, final exams and things like that. Here's the thing. even those things that entertain us and that distract us and that make fun of our jobs and the whimsy that exists in moments of our jobs, that's not anywhere close to a significant amount of time that we spend in our jobs. I spend more time in meetings in any one month than I do in the entirety of the year giving final exams. And so those things that flash up that make us smirk or laugh or things like that, that even those don't really comprise much of the daily work a lot of people are doing. And I'm someone who loves my job. I'm actually fortunate enough to be able to enjoy what I do and really like savor that. I don't, I enjoy having vacation and spending time with my family, but I also don't mind going to work. I enjoy spending my time at work, and most of my days there are really quite happy. But there are times where I'm, like having to sit in a meeting or spend some time grading something that I would much rather be spending time just working with my students. So all of us deal with that. And here's a guy say, like, wouldn't it be great to have an entertainment that's like that? And then 200 pages later, Wallace does exactly that, where he famously has these double columns of so-and-so turns a page, so-and-so turns a page, irrelevant Chris Fogel turns a page, someone turns 2 pages by accident and turns a page back. And that people made a lot of jokes about that. It was realistic. It was a conceit by Wallace, but also it was only like 6 pages of it. Or 12 if you want to include the double column. But it's not as if Wallace did that for pages and pages and pages. He includes it as one 6-page joke within the book, which I think, again, shows it's conceited, but it's also more mature to do it in that way, and to even be prefacing doing that with jokes. So I thought that was really fun, really interesting. And so there's all sorts of little voices that emerge in there. There's some people who have all sorts of questions. And Wallace had written a note about why is this happening? And maybe there's an idea that they're trying to figure out what are the experiences that make the very, very best people at this horribly mundane job. Because underneath there's this whole competition going on about, can we totally automate this tax return examination and maximize, government revenue, profits in a sense for the government from that, versus training people to be really good at this job and then making them stay in this job. And that gets into this whole idea now around what AI is doing, or machine learning, or deep learning, or any of those that Wallace was not on the cusp of at that point, but he's seeing the ways that automation had replaced various jobs. So the way he explores that is really interesting. Another section that's really interesting, he has a whole section about basically a couple of characters talking about civics versus selfishness, and the way that they make statements about the 14th Amendment or about Magna Carta, things like that, and the different entertainments they get within different decades. And there's something very interesting about civics and selfishness, and we get to ride the crest of it. Here in the US, we expect government and law to be our conscience, our super ego, you could say. It has something to do with liberal individualism and something to do with capitalism, but I don't understand much of the theoretical aspect. What I see is what I live in. Americans are in a way crazy. We infantilize ourselves. We don't think of ourselves as citizens, part of something larger to which we have profound responsibilities. We think of ourselves as citizens when it comes to our rights and privileges, but not our responsibilities. We abdicate our civic responsibilities to the government and expect the government, in effect, to legislate morality. I'm talking mostly about economics and business because that's my area. The next person, what do we do to stop the decline? And the reply, I have no idea what we do. As citizens, we cede more and more of our autonomy. But if we, the government, take away the citizens' freedom to cede their autonomy, we're now taking away their autonomy. It's a paradox. Citizens are constitutionally empowered to choose to default and leave the decisions to corporations and to a government we expect to control them. Corporations are getting better and better at seducing us into thinking the way they think, of profits as the telos and responsibility, as something to be enshrined in symbol and evaded in reality. Cleverness as opposed to wisdom, wanting and having instead of thinking and making. We cannot stop it. I suspect what will happen is there will be some sort of disaster, depression, hyperinflation, and then it'll be showtime. We'll either wake up and retake our freedom, or we'll fall apart utterly, like Rome, conqueror of its own people. And this goes on for about 10 pages of this entire dialogue. And it really is crafted like the type of dialogue that one would see in the Platonic dialogues or in the philosophical dialogues of the 18th century in France, except it's with Wallace's ironic, smirking tones. But there's a truth to what he's getting at, and he does not mask the truth with as much of his cynical, smirking, sophomoric jokes in this book as he had in his other work. So there's really a lot to appreciate in this. But I did want to get into two sort of last little bits, before closing this out, because I'm hoping, I don't want to spoil it, because I'm hoping folks will get in and read this and just really dig in and see, like, how is this relevant now in the 2020s? Because it is. And what does it mean to view ourselves as citizens of a nation or of a world in terms of our responsibilities rather than just in terms of what we want and have? So there's famously a long novella there's basically the interview from one of the best wigglers, somebody who's really good at his job. And it's all about how he sort of fell into this job. And he goes through, it's very funny, it's very long, but it all comes down to this chance encounter. And that's this crucial idea, is that there's this chance encounter where this guy landed in the wrong classroom during final exam time. And he had dropped out of college a couple of times. Now he's back. Something has happened that has caused him to be distracted. I don't want to spoil what that is. But there's something really beautiful within this novella. And there's this sub-teacher in there who's talking about accounting and what he goes to. And he goes, "It was all very strange. I also noticed that now he had his hands behind his back in something like the parade rest military position. He said to the accounting students, 'All right then, before you leave here to resume that crude approximation of a human life you have heretofore called a life, I will undertake to inform you of certain truths. I will then offer an opinion as to how you might most profitably view and respond to those truths.' I was immediately aware that he didn't seem to be talking about the advanced tax final exam. He said, 'You will return to your homes and families for the holiday vacation. In that festive interval before the last push of CPA examination study, trust me, you will hesitate. You will feel dread and doubt. This will be natural. You will, for what seems the first time, feel dread at your hometown chum's sallies about accountancy as the career before you. You will read the approval in your parents' smiles as an approval of your surrender. Oh, I have been there, gentlemen. I know every cobble in the road you are walking. For the hour approaches to begin in that literally dreadful interval of looking down before the leap outward, to hear dolorous forecasts as to the sheer drudgery of the profession you are choosing, the lack of excitement or chance to shine on the athletic fields or ballroom floors of life heretofore. True, some of it I didn't get. I don't think too many of us in the classroom had spent a lot of time shining on ballroom floors, but that might have just been a generational thing. He obviously meant it as a metaphor. I certainly got what he meant about accounting not seeming like a very exciting profession. The substitute continued. To experience commitment as the loss of options, a type of death, the death of childhood's limitless possibility, of the flattery of choice without duress, this will happen, mark me, childhood's end. The first of many deaths. Hesitation is natural, doubt is natural." He smiled slightly. "You might wish to recall then in 3 weeks' time, should you be so disposed, this room, this moment, and the information I shall now relay to you." And he continues on in this, but he gets deeper into this long peroration. It's a threnody, like something out of someone cheering on Lancelot or something in Mallory. And he goes, continuing on without pause, he said, "Exacting, prosaic, banasic to the point of drudgery, sometimes, often tedious, perhaps, but brave, worthy, fitting, sweet, romantic, chivalric, heroic." When he paused, it wasn't just for effect, at least not totally. "Gentlemen," he said, by which I mean, of course, latter adolescents who aspire to manhood, "gentlemen, here is a truth. Enduring tedium over real time in a confined space is what real courage is. Such endurance is, as it happens, the distillate of what is today, in this world neither I nor you have made, heroism. Heroism." He made a point of looking around, gauging people's reaction. Nobody laughed. A few looked puzzled. I remember I was starting to have to go to the bathroom. In the classroom's fluorescent lights, he cast no shadow on any side. By which, he said, I mean true heroism, not heroism as you might have known it from films or the tales of childhood. You are now nearly at childhood's end. You are ready for the truth's weight to bear it. The truth is that the heroism of your childhood entertainments was not true valor, it was theater. The grand gesture, the moment of choice, the mortal danger, the external foe, the climactic battle whose outcome resolves all designed to appear heroic, to excite and gratify an audience. An audience. He made a gesture I can't describe. Gentlemen, welcome to the world of reality. There is no audience, no one to applaud, to admire, no one to see you. Do you understand? Here is the truth. Actual heroism receives no ovation, entertains no one. No one queues up to see it. No one is interested. This continues for a few more pages, and I don't want to read the rest of it because reading 250-ish pages of this book and then getting to that point where there's this stirring sense of someone who really believes that there can be something profound in dedicating oneself to being the best in the most mundane experiences and to finding a peace within that is powerful. Whether I agree or disagree with it, whether Wallace himself or the character within the book who's telling this story and this memory agrees with any of that. Notice at one point in the middle of this stirring speech, he feels like he's got to go to the bathroom. There's something really powerful in that. And how do we choose to respond to those moments in our own lives? What are those moments in our own lives? I think that's worth reflecting on. This is a book that, because it aspires to examine what is happening at the heart of our choices, what is the driving momentum behind most of the choices we make, because it probes that with this knife over and over and over and shows us different people who have made their peace or failed their peace, in a sense, with these decisions, who are happy or incredibly miserable in their lives. That gets us to reflect on our own decisions, our own lives, and what are we doing? Am I behaving differently now, a month after reading this book, than I was the month before? Did it cause me to refocus in any way? Did it cause me to look at my relationship with my family differently? That's what a really strong and inquisitive book can do. And so I've really, really enjoyed this. There is a whole section where, on section 9, author's forward, author here, meaning the real author, the living human holding the pencil, not some abstract narrative persona. Granted, there sometimes is such a persona in The Pale King, but that's mainly a pro forma statutory construct, an entity that exists just for legal and commercial purposes, rather like a corporation. Where Wallace introduces himself as a character, of course. At least he's willing to just call himself David Wallace within it, rather than wrap up some auto fiction a la Nosgard or A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. But he has this metafictional persona in here where he's explaining that he really worked for the IRS for a year because he had some issues at school that he goes into. And some of those are pretty funny and a little sour and cynical. But the David Wallace passages, you can always tell them. They have the footnotes. They are more, there are no long endnotes like Infinite Jest, but there are the footnotes the way he had in his later essays, or even some of his stories where he's making you jump a little bit. But those passages, because they're not overwhelming, I think work really well. They help change up what's happening. And the David Wallace character provides a little bit of unity across a work that, because it's unfinished, is discursive and tangential at times, and one does have to pay attention to the text. And that leads me to the final novella. Is all about two people. Almost the entire thing is two people talking at sort of an after work happy hour one afternoon, and there's the guy who seems like he's almost totally like disengaged from social reality. He's almost certainly he's supposed to be neurodivergent, and so the way that he interacts with the character, he's taking everything very literally, and he'll respond to questions that way. And she's the most beautiful woman in the office, and she's explaining why she works there, and what in her life has led her to this point. And there's some real depression, truly depression that this character has experienced, and that some of the other characters clearly are experiencing. But the way that they express it and talk to each other, one of the things that becomes clear is that what makes this conversation different for this character Meredith is that usually people are, again, viewing her as a commodity, as someone to be seduced or to be lusted after, not to be listened to, or to, in another way, to be saved, to be rescued, not to be, again, listened to. And she finally has someone who is actually listening to her. And that's what makes the conversation so interesting, is she will ask a question and she's used to a certain response that is the pat response or the pitying response or the seductive response, and instead she gets the literal answer to her question. And what emerges in my mind is that the attention this other character Shane is paying her is something she's never really received in her life, except for maybe one other time, and even that turned out to maybe be a false start. And the attention he's paying her is, first of all, it's the attention that I think on a conceit level Wallace expects us to be paying attention to and attending to his text, but it's on a humane level, it's the attention we should be paying to those we care about. And even those we don't care about, if we paid that much attention to them, we impute care to them, and suddenly the relationship between us changes. We don't have to love them, but we attend to their humanity. We allow our voice and our mind to be the receptacle, the echo chamber for their voice for a moment. And there's something that's incredibly affirming in the humanity there. And so, like I said, I really, really liked this. There are some hilarious passages. There's one about, there are characters who have weird things. One recalls facts and details. He reads minds, but he's essentially reading memories, and they're weird details that have no bearing on 99% of what he gets. Is just nonsense. Excuse me. And it's again that joke about the idea that this is the age of interruption. Like we're overstuffed with detail and sensory distraction, and just we are overwhelmed by it, and so we revert. And so this guy, his is taken to an exponential degree, where he knows people's blood pressures, or something about someone, broke a finger or cut their hair in a weird way as a kid, but has no bearing on what's actually happening there. And it contrasts with the character who has this long 80-page memory about how his entire life changed from wandering into the wrong final exam, and final exam prep session, and what had led him to that. So, as I said, this book contains multitudes. I intend to reread it. Hilariously, this copy I got from the library, I got about 350 pages in, and it became clear that no one else in the intervening 15 years had ever finished this book, because the pages had to be pulled apart, they weren't entirely uncut and separated. And so it was interesting to get to that point and be like, no one's made it this far in the book. But I'm not sure why, because I loved this. I really, really did. It's by far my favorite of his extended fictions. So now, in terms of a recommended, if you like, because there's a few, certainly with Wallace, the aspects of the Pale King that are best are the aspects that are in his best stories in Oblivion, like The Soul is Not a Smithy, things like that, or his later essays in Consider the Lobster, or even some of his essays in Supposedly Fun Thing I'll Never Do Again. Those, if you've enjoyed those, The Pale King is excellent. It is very different from The Broom of the System. Again, the characters here are characters, not people, to a problematic degree, in terms of they're just cardboard for him to move around on a chessboard. There's a lot more humanity in Infinite Jest, but the encyclopedic, aspirational nature of this book is something that maybe the Pale King would have become. Maybe it would have become this 21st century War and Peace, or In Search of Lost Time, that is supposed to encompass everything. It is perhaps, however, to the strength of the book that it's only 550 pages. In terms of some influences, the voice, the humane voice at the heart of the book, in the best passages, recall J.D. Salinger at his more mature work in Zooey or in Raise High the Roofbeam Carpenters. I think that's sort of the voice he was getting at. The cynical nature of corporate life, bureaucratic life, and the disappointment that involves recalls Revolutionary Road by Richard Yates, the gloriously mundane John Updike, who Wallace was a deep reader of, but I also think what he was really getting at was he was trying to fuse this massive fiction with these deep truths, these aphorisms, these profound ideas. And so in a way he was getting at Boethius with the Consolation of Philosophy, or Montaigne with his essays, or even Kafka with the aphorisms and the parables in his Blue Octavo notebooks, or his diaries. There's something that was really what Wallace was focused on, to an extent that putting the spotlight on that rather than on like some alliterative joke is just so different. It's such a refreshing difference, I think. There certainly were like the massive maximalist influences, whether it's William Gaddis in both JR and the Recognitions. I think these exerted a powerful and beneficent influence. I think there was a way in which he was trying to get at what Don DeLillo did with Underworld, where DeLillo was able to tie together all these incoherent strands and provide them with some unity. And Wallace, I don't know, maybe he would have got there, maybe not, but it was something that I think he was aiming for something like that in the end. I had mentioned that the scarier, like more harrowing sections focusing on the character Tony recall early Cormac McCarthy, Dennis Johnson's fictions. Some of the ways that the characters relate to each other reminded me a little bit of Janet Hobhouse's Dancing in the Dark. Great sort of 1970s, 1980s novel. Contrasts in heroism, recall certainly Stephen Crane with The Red Badge of Courage, but then moving forward to something like Closely Watched Trains by Bohemia Hrabal, where we see characters who have to make a decision about how they take a stand, or will they make a stand. And this is something that Wallace is sort of parodying, but also examining. We don't make those stands anymore. What is the stand we make? Or perhaps we will one day, but right now we're not. And then finally that emphasis on the power of a single sentence, the power of this almost disembodied dialogue that gets at actual ideas, reminded me of Ava by Carole Maso. So there's much more in the book. There's a whole section on the etymology of boredom that is very, very funny. A character like goes on all these tangents about boredom and ultimately ends with soul murdering. But as I said, at the heart of the book, I find it to be, in my reading, an incredibly affirming book that we can have a difference. We can provide the audience that is lacking in our daily lives. We can provide that audience to each other, and we do that through BookTube as well. So let me know if you've read this one. As I said, I wouldn't make this your first David Foster Wallace unless you're, I don't know, in your 30s or later, and you've had some time in life to experience the disappointments he's focusing on here. But for younger readers, I would say try some of his stories, try his nonfiction, and then if you enjoy that voice, if you enjoy the smirking attitude he can provide while also trying to get at something deeper, then go for The Pale King, because I loved it. I intend to get a copy. I'll be rereading this sometime. So let me know what you think. Hope everyone's doing well. Thank you.